Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. I'm your host, Josh Steimle. Carol Roth is a TV pundit and host, entrepreneur, and self-described recovering investment banker. She's also the New York Times bestselling author of The Entrepreneur Equation. And she just came out with her latest book, The War on Small Business: How the Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America, which was published by Broadside Books, a division of HarperCollins. Carol advocates for small business, small government, and big hair. Carol, welcome to the show.
Thanks for that great introduction. Very pleased to be here with you, Josh.
And I think I got to say, I didn't come up with the big hair thing. Carol came up with that. So I'm not making fun of her or anything. That's her thing.
No, that's literally my advocacy. Small business, small government, big hair.
Awesome. And I'm excited to talk to Carol today because she, like me, kind of leans libertarian, and we don't go into politics on this show, but we share a lot of the same sentiments about the content of her book. But we're also here to learn about the story behind the book and how her books have shaped her career. But before we dive into that, Carol, give us some background on who you are and where you come from and what you do.
Oh, Lord. All right. So the $5 version is that I came from a family where neither of my parents were college graduates. My mom was a stay-at-home mom turned sort of hobby entrepreneur, and my father was an electrician. And so I was the first in my family to have the opportunity to go to college. I got myself into Wharton just after my parents had decided that they were getting divorced. My dad had been laid off at the time and was like, I don't know how you are planning to pay for this college, but good luck to you. And oh, by the way, you can't go do this and take on debt unless you're going to be able to pay that off really quickly. So that was kind of the mantra in my head, but I had done enough research and I knew there were a lot of opportunities if you went to a great school at that point in time and did well. So I fortunately devoted my time to making sure that I was in a position to do well. And there were a couple opportunities at that point for people who like to do a deep dive into something. They usually go into management consulting. And for people who have ADD and like to do a million different things at once, they go into investment banking. And that's the route that I decided to pursue. That's a phrase that not everybody understands and sometimes gets bantered about. So where I was in an arena called corporate finance, which meant that I helped companies raise capital to expand as well as doing mergers and acquisitions. And there in the mid 90s and late 90s, if there was a restaurant company or in some cases consumer products or technology company, those were the kinds of businesses that I raised money to make sure that they could expand their business. So if you were sitting at a cheesecake factory at any time in the past few years or in the years to come, I probably helped get them some of the capital to be able to do that. So those kinds of things. And I loved investment banking and it was a very successful career. I was a vice president and an officer by the time I was 25 years old. I kind of skipped over the MBA path and just kind of kept pursuing the career. I didn't really want to be an investment banker for life. It was never something that I had sort of aspired to do. And even though I enjoyed it, our company had gone through some mergers and the culture had changed. And so eventually it was an opportunity for me to go explore other things. And even though the first thing I explored was doing my own investment bank, eventually I kind of extracted myself from that. But a couple things came out of that. One is that when I was an investment banker, I would get calls from small business owners all the time saying, can you help me? And the reality was I couldn't because they couldn't afford the retainer fees and they couldn't afford the overall fees that the investment banks were charging. And so, I kind of was like, well, there's got to be a way to get information to small business owners at scale. At the same time, I always had a personality that wasn't maybe the best suited for investment banking, even though I did a pretty good job at it. And that's like I always said what was on my mind. And people kept going, you should be on TV. And I'm like, yes, I want to be a game show host. Like, how do I get on TV? And all of this craziness sort of conspired for me to, in addition to some of the other things that I pursue a career in media and use that as a way to leverage feedback and information and guidance to small business owners and entrepreneurs at scale. So there was sort of that intention sort of, kind of positioned me over there. And then, all help broke loose after that.
In investment banking, I mean, it's a ton of work too. That's the other side. People think it's all about money, but you're putting in a ton of hours, right?
Yeah, it was like probably like 16 to 20 hours a day, up to 7 days a week for multiple years. And it hasn't shifted. I've been reading some of the articles, and I have a mentee who's going through his first year right now. And yeah, I mean, it's just one of those, it's a grind, but what it does, if you're willing to sort of sacrifice and give everything to the job, you learn a ton. You get a lot of financial flexibility and you get a lot of professional flexibility. So it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And the other thing I would say, because my husband, who I met in the company gym, and he was actually a sales trader, and I convinced him that trading was dying in that mechanism. It was going electronic and he should switch to investment banking, which he did. He continued on that path for a while and then became a partner at a different investment bank. He is also now a recovering investment banker as well. But I can tell you, even as a partner in a firm, he was still pulling crazy hours and still working weekends and things like that. So that doesn't ever really go away. You're probably not working 20 hours, but it's definitely, it's a well-paying job, but it's one that's like always there with you, that the people who work there work very hard.
I guess on the plus side, once you've done that, everything else maybe seems easier.
It's funny. Not really, because it's a very defined path and it's a very defined process. And like it's like a really big learning curve. And once you get up the curve and you understand it, there's like only so many different variables that come up. I mean, yes, each deal has its sort of unique qualities to it. And there are differences in market environments and whatnot. But there's only so many things that can kind of go wrong or go sideways, or that you have to learn once you have that knowledge base. Where so many of the other arenas that I've been involved in, places like Hollywood and traditional media, where there is no kind of clear set path and where things can go sideways for all kinds of factors. I've been working as an outsourced chief customer officer and joint venture partner with a collectible toy company for 16 years, and all of the issues that come up there. So I actually think in some ways it's like, it's hard in terms of getting up that knowledge curve, but like once you have it, I think it's actually in many ways, as long as you have that endurance, easier than some of these other arenas where there isn't that path and things kind of come out of nowhere.
Right, which leads into the book. I mean, with entrepreneurship, it's a different challenge every single day. And no matter what you figure out, it seems like there's always something new coming up. So for you, what was the inspiration then that led to the first book that made you say, I'm passionate enough about this that I'm going to put in the time and effort to put this book out there?
So I didn't intend to write a book when I wrote it. I was writing lots of content. I was doing videos online. I was on, I think, maybe touching social media at that point, not too much, but like a blog and things like that. And I was just getting really mad, kind of like I had previously in investment banking, at the really bad advice that small business owners were getting. And also the people who were sort of glossing over it as like, oh, well, that's easy. And it's really, really difficult, and it's really risky, and it doesn't get enough appreciation. And so I just got mad, and I just like started vomiting words onto a page. And like within 6 weeks, I had like 80,000 words. And I went, oh, I guess this is a book. And so that then was like, well, do I want to have a book? well, sure, that seems kind of cool. And so then I went through completely backwards. I do so many things backwards, but completely backwards. Then I went to try to find an agent and then try to find a publisher. And then as a first-time author / diva, I broke up with my first publisher, found a second publisher that was a better fit, and kind of all of these ups and downs. But then I spent a year and a half on the marketing plan, because at that point, the kind of sales of the book and kind of the packaging around it becoming a bestseller and all those things were really important. I was doing speaking, and I was doing, kind of brand things. And so I wanted to have that. So I really did a lot of very out of the box things, including creating my own action figure that was a premium that went along with the books, to kind of really focus on the marketing, which was a completely different experience than my second book.
All right. So first question, where do I get the action figure? And second question, breaking up with your agent or your publisher, that's something most authors don't do, especially first-time authors. So I've got to hear that story.
Yeah. So I don't know if you can see this over here. So right behind me is the action figure, and you can find them usually on eBay. Someone usually has one up for sale on eBay. That's usually the easiest place to get it. And that came, again, fortunately, I work with this collectible toy company. So for me to get them to do that was not as difficult as it would be anyone else to get somebody to do that. So that was a cool thing. So again, going back to what I started with is that having been an investment banker, I have a lot of flexibility, and I had a lot of financial flexibility. And so from my standpoint, I was in that space where if I was going to do this, I wanted to do it the right way and the way that served my purposes. And the first publisher kept doing things like, let's call this the no nonsense guide to entrepreneurship. And I was like, no, first of all, I would never say that. That sounds like Ned Flanders. And it's not really what the book's about. My my original title for the book was Stop, Drop, and Don't Quit Your Day Job. That was literally the title for it. So we were going from that to the no nonsense guide to entrepreneurship. And it's just so not aligned with my personality. And they just kind of weren't getting there from a branding. So my thought was well, screw it. If I have to self-publish it, I will still get it to the market. It'd be great to find a publisher, but if I don't, I'm okay with that. And not everybody's in that position. And, not everybody is in the same place or has the same personality or the same objectives. But for me, that was the right thing to do. So yeah, as a first-time author who even found a great publisher, to then put the kibosh on it was a big deal. And I'm super glad that I did it. The second publisher, who's the actual publisher of the book, BenBella, was fantastic to work with. Loved them, thought they did a tremendous job, and were just great partners.
Yeah, I hear lots of good things about BenBella. So how did you get connected with them, and how did you get that deal?
So I worked, and you may have heard of her, with a woman named Elizabeth Marshall, who I love and adore. And she is a sort of thought leadership guru and helps people with brands kind of, step into their branding. And she was doing sort of book quarterbacking at the time, which I don't believe is a focus of hers anymore. And she had a good experience with some of her other authors in BenBella. So really, she kind of made the connection, and then my agent ran with it, even though he already knew them. He didn't do it. So that basically made the connection, and I hit it off with Glenn, who is the actual publisher and the CEO of the company. And as I said, tremendous, have every great thing to say, and would recommend any author to work with him. And in fact, on my second book, because as we'll get into, I was approached on it, I actually called him first before I accepted the author, and just said, hey, they brought it to me. And so I can't bring it to you because it's not my concept. And just to give them the courtesy, because, I really do have that level of respect for what they do at BenBella.
Cool. So you went through the process, you get the book comes out, and then what's the reception like on your first book?
It was fantastic. It was fantastic. The amount of emails that I have gotten over the years, and I wrote this 10 plus years ago now. People like, I saved their 401ks. I saved them six figures, for something that they were going to go into on a whim, as well as people who've been very successful and said, I needed to jump through that to prove to myself that this was the right thing for me, has been really, really gratifying. And the funny thing, as so many potential authors or content creators or other people will tell you, is that many of the people who turned it down, many of the publishers who turned it down the first time around said, we really don't like it because it's not inspirational. Like you're too much telling the truth. You're giving it. It's kind of a slap in the face. You're crushing people's dreams. I don't know that reality crushes people's dreams, but whatever. That was their perception. And as soon as it was successful, the same people were calling me back, being like, what we really loved about it? It was so different. It wasn't that like same old, bright-eyed, starry-eyed entrepreneurship dream thing. I was like, you literally turned it down for the same reason. So everybody wants to jump on something that's hot. And when you do something that's different or contrarian, it's harder. It's harder to get it done, but it was something that was needed in the market. And, as I mentioned, I get these calls from or emails from entrepreneurs. I also get a lot of intermediaries, and particularly folks who are mentors with places like Score, who we distributed a lot of the books to, and other places who say, the amount of times that I've handed this book to somebody, like it's been just like an enormous resource. And it's just much easier to outsource that dream crushing, I guess, right? You don't want to tell somebody that it's a bad business idea or they don't have what it takes. But when they can go through and hand them the book, and I can tell them that for them, it makes it much easier for a lot of people in their relationships. So I'm very proud of that book. As I said, it's a resource today. The one thing I'll say about it, where once in a while I get a little point of confusion, is this is like a small business book, which is like 99.9% of the businesses. It's not a venture capital startup book. Like if you have a tech company that's going to raise like $20 million in your first two series, like, yeah, this is not you, but like you're the exception, you're not the rule. And so if you read it and go, well, that's, it hasn't been my experience in Silicon Valley. Like, yeah, I know you're in this microcosm and you're not the audience for the book. You could still take something away, I think. But it's really meant for the traditional small business owner, which, as I mentioned, is 99.9% of the businesses, not just here in the US, but worldwide. And the book's actually been translated into languages like Korean as well. So I have a Korean version. And I get emails from people, throughout the world that say nice things about the book. So that's a good feeling as well.
Quick break here. Are you an entrepreneur? Do you want to write a book that will help you grow your business? Visit publishedauthor.com, where we have programs to fit every budget, programs that will help you write and publish your book in as little as 90 days, starting at just $39 per month. Or, if you're too busy to write your book, we'll interview you and then write and publish your book for you. Don't let the valuable knowledge and experience you have go to waste. Head on over to publishedauthor.com to get the help you need to become a published author. You've already waited long enough. Do it today. Now, back to the show. All right. So it's obvious that you put a lot of passion into your books, and your books might come from a place of frustration or anger with some sort of situation. And that certainly seems to be the case with your second book. So tell us the story behind the second book. What was it that made you feel like, all right, I have got to put this one out?
So apparently I also always get approached during a financial crisis or around a financial crisis. I was approached and was in a documentary about the auto bailouts. I was in a series called Booked about The Big Short, which was about the Great Recession financial crisis. So this one comes about, and HarperCollins, who I had been acquainted with my editor over there previously, and he followed me on Twitter and kind of had talked about some things, came to me with the idea, very macro, hey, I think this is going to be a historic economic story. Do you want to capture that for posterity? And at that point, right, I was grounded. So I like went from somebody who was like flying all the time to like sitting in my desk at home. I wasn't doing speaking engagements because they were all canceled, those kinds of things. And I had some extra bandwidth, and like a moron went like, oh yeah, that sounds fun. That seems like a good task. No, I'm just kidding though. I actually really enjoyed it. So they were the ones that planted the seed and was their concept to do something. Now, in terms of what it turned out to be, we really collaborated on that. And I truthfully wrote 3.5 different books with 3 different titles during the course of the pandemic unfolding, because things changed very rapidly. New information would come out. But one big piece of it that was the through line was the small business piece and the government picking winners and losers, and how that always went wrong for small business. How in this case, they were told that they weren't essential. And it wasn't based on data or science, but it was purely based on political clout and connections. And the outgrowth of that was the most historic transfer of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street that has ever been seen in history. So, that ended up being the story that needed to be told, even though it was kind of like a component of the story as it was unfolding. But man, was this a different experience and a lot of work. I mean, first of all, it's going to just be different than anything else because I'm sitting in the middle of a real-time situation as it unfolds, and it's historic and there are no benchmarks, and I'm literally taking information and then rejiggering it as new information comes out. Like everything is sourced. Like you cannot go like more than a couple sentences in the book without there being a footnote. And so very, very heavily sourced. And there was so much to say, and to just like have to like kind of chip away and only say 90,000 words worth of what I had to say, because my editor said nobody's going to want to read past that. That was hard. So it was a hard thing to do. And it wasn't a marketing focused book. Like I didn't spend my time on the marketing like I did on the last book. This was very much a news, economic, political, real time, current events, historic thing that I was crafting. And so that's where my time went.
Got it. So your first book, it became a New York Times bestseller, right?
Correct.
And this book, it just came out in June. We're recording this in July, so it's really early on in the process, but how's it doing so far?
So I say it's doing fine. Like it's certainly not at embarrassing levels, but it's certainly not at the levels that I came out of the gate with my last one. And again, part of that is because of the structure of the marketing programs and the intention behind it. The other challenge that I've had this time around is that even though I'm somebody who's in the media and have been kind of media adjacent for about a dozen years, and I have people whose shows I've been on over and over again, a lot of the what I'll call corporate press or mainstream media doesn't want to cover the book. And I think there are 2 reasons, as I've spent many hours, because my publisher is also highly confused by this, right? This is a major publisher that has authors on these shows all the time and literally told me, like, this is our plan. There's 2 reasons. One is that they were very complicit in many ways in covering up or at least shaping this information. And a lot of their comrades or sponsors or co-conspirators or whatever you want to call them are these big companies. And so perhaps they don't want to rock the boat on that. I think the bigger issue is that this is a nonpartisan book, and we live in highly partisan times when it comes to the traditional media. So if I had called this book Trump's War on Small Business, or the Democrats' war on small business, or Biden's war on small business, I guarantee you the coverage of this book would have been entirely different. Now, the book would have been disingenuous, and it wouldn't have been a book that I wanted to write, so that wasn't going to happen. And in many places where I was kind of pushed to go in a direction, I'm like, I'm sorry, the thesis just doesn't support that. So I'm not gonna, that's not the story we're gonna tell here. But there is a really important story to tell, which, by the way, everyone who's read it and people on social media and whatnot, it's get a ton of traction. So there's an audience for this information, even though the people with the platforms don't necessarily want to put it out there. So I do think, just sort of a gut feel, that this book is going to have a long tail on it. And already the way that it's rolling is I'm starting to get the attention of, like, not necessarily mainstream people, but people with bigger platforms who are like, oh, that's interesting, and who are willing to kind of, take it and shepherd it and want to share the information. And frankly, as we're recording this, all of this stuff about the Delta or Lambda, Omega Mu variants, whatever they want to, call them this week, and the potential for more lockdowns and more mandates and kids wearing masks at school, like, kind of the trajectory that they're trying to push this in is not a good one. And so I feel between that and sort of the outgrowth of what's going to end up happening with these small businesses that we're not going to see for long periods of time, will put a long tail on this in terms of sort of a historical record. So I want as many people to have it as possible, because I think it's an important book that helps to educate people and give them the tools and the resources to carry on conversations that are already being covered up right now in the media. But in terms of, like, my life, whether or not this hits the bestseller list or not, like, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum, because on the one hand, you could say there's a lesson here for authors of, hey, if you want your book to get picked up by the media, you have to tell the story that the media already wants to tell. It's got to fit their narrative. On the other hand, you have to be true to yourself. And so there's that friction there.
I want to elaborate on that, because this is really, one of the things that my publisher and my editor in particular was really focused on is, like, they won't do a book unless it's the first to market, the contrarian take, or you just happen to be, like, the most popular person on the planet. So this did fit the normal media narrative of, this is the first one to market, telling a big story that applies to a lot of people, like half the economy. So the normal formula of that theoretically should have garnered more attention that it did. So I think that speaks to how even that focus, like what the media wants, has shifted so real time, and how completely politicized that has gotten, unfortunately, I think, to the detriment of all of us.
Yeah. Now, when did you start working on the book? When did you start writing it?
So I started writing it, I want to say it was like June of 2020. So pretty early on. I'd written an op-ed, which was kind of repurposed in the book back in March. So, like, before the CARES Act, like right when this all started going down. And then, kind of in earnest, really started digging in June.
Okay.
Like the very beginning of June.
And like you said, you rewrote the book 3 times. What were some of the events that changed what you felt like you needed to write about, the stories that you needed to tell?
I don't know that it was any specific events as much as just sort of some of the reporting that came out and, like, changed things that we thought we knew. I mean, there were things like Fauci coming out in June and basically admitting that he had intentionally misled the public on masks, which, again, I don't care which side, and maybe you agree with where he was. It doesn't matter. All I care about is the flip-flop and the shift in it. And so, me going back to then, oh, that's interesting, what was said in February. Oh, look, in February, every single one of these media not only told us not to wear masks, but that it was dangerous for us. And then, like, having to kind of go back and trace that path. There was reporting that came out, also from Kate Kelly, who I used to collaborate with at CNBC, and some others who were at the New York Times, about the big fall off in the market in February, and how, that was in part due to leaked insider information. And so that's like, I'd known that there was, that event happened, but like then going back and putting that context around it, like reshaped the importance of that. So it was a lot more of that kind of stuff. And also just getting like other stuff away. And then, the amount of Federal Reserve support and the sort of U-turn of the market and the Fed, increasing its balance sheet, trillions and trillions of dollars, really changed the narrative too, because, if you were looking at this in March, the stock market had completely tanked, and June 5th, we're hitting new highs. So like there were just so many things that kind of shifted. And then just as I was digging into each of these things, like trying to construct what happened and seeing the through lines, the more that came out, the more that it, became clear that the information on the CARES Act, who got the money in the CARES Act. Obviously, I had the first sort of take of it, but then you had and by the way, it went to Kanye West, who also was named a billionaire by Forbes and, announced his partnership with The Gap. Like those kinds of things where it's like, okay, so it seems like there's a lot going on in this big versus small thing. So it's that kind of stuff that as it was playing out, kind of cleaning away. And so the book informed what it was. It wasn't that I went in with a point of view and said, let me try to prove this thesis. It was the opposite. And, for anybody who looks at the title, it's really it's not just a book about small business and COVID. It's actually a much bigger thing, a bigger messaging around decentralization versus central power. And that's really what the book is about. There's a full chapter on the Fed. There's a full chapter on a relationship with China. And certainly there's a tie into COVID and there's a tie into small business. But a lot of people are surprised at sort of how deep and rich the book is in terms of that bigger narrative.
Right, because this is not a new game for big business. Big business has been doing this, well, essentially throughout history, but really you could point to the Federal Reserve as a starting point for accelerating the war on small business. But even before that, I mean, with the so-called robber barons, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, I mean, those people, they had their interests and they used government as a weapon against their big enemies, against their small enemies. Can you tell us a little bit more about... I was going to say,
it sounds like you've been reading some Rothbard.
I'm reading everything. But yeah, it's like, and I'm a small business owner. So I see this, right? Because I see, well, wait a second. I own a small business and we're getting, I mean, in the CARES Act, there was the PPP and all that stuff and everybody got a piece of that, but that's not the whole game, right? Because there's this part of the game where people, one of the things that I feel like people don't understand is they say, well, hey, this law, this regulation, it's hurting big business. So that's a good thing, right? Because it's keeping big business under control. And I always say you have to look further than that. It's not about whether it's harming the big business or not. It's about how much it harms the small business versus harming the big business. If it harms small business more than it hurts the big business, that's a win for big business because it's taking out their competitors. So,
or sometimes it's actually blanketed as something that is anti-big business, and it's not small business even talked about, and they bear the consequences. And that's one of the things I talk about very early on in the book with Dodd-Frank, which is the regulation that came out of the financial crisis, where big banks did things that obviously were too risky. We all suffered the consequence of that. And through their own actions and us paying the price, we bailed them out because they were told they were too big to fail. Okay, great. So the slap on the wrist they were going to get was this regulation. Well, what did the regulation do? It completely decimated the formation of new small and community banks. It put a bunch of small business banks out of business because they couldn't afford to comply with the rules and regulations. And then as one might be able to extrapolate, if you have small business lenders going out of business, you have less small business lending. So it ended up giving the bigger banks the ability to lend more to big businesses, took away their competition. So what was meant to rein in the big banks gave them free rein. And that just sort of is a prime example of the type of thing that happens over and over again every time we try to stick it to the big guy and help the little guy.
Yeah. And Sarbanes-Oxley too, same thing. I mean, it made it hard for small businesses to go public versus big businesses. Well, of course, the big business has money. They can do whatever they need to do. The small business, those are the ones who are hurt because all of a sudden it costs them $5 million more to do what they want to do.
Right.
So what are some of the other takeaways from the book in terms of this war on small business? What are some of the things that people out there who might not be small business owners who say, I mean, there are people who kind of lump business owners all into the same category. Oh, if you're a business owner, you're wearing a monocle and a top hat, or like the Monopoly man, you're running around trying to steal people's bags of money. And it's like, well, no, there's big business, there's small business, there's good big business, there's good small business, and there's bad of every kind. But what are some of the myths you're trying to bust, or some of the lessons you're trying to get across through your book?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just education. There are things that people hear about, but they don't quite know what's going on. The Federal Reserve is one of them. I explain it in very easy to understand language and explain how they have really facilitated this wealth transfer and how they have given big companies an unfair advantage over little companies and frankly over the average American, which I think is really important, as well as just understanding the makeup of our economy. When I talk to a lot of people and I say, well, how many big businesses do you think there are? They think there are millions of big businesses, and there aren't. There's about 10 to 15,000, depending on how you categorize them, versus small businesses where before COVID, there were 30.2 million of them. So if you look at sort of a spectrum or a pie, like whatever way is easier for you to visualize, half of the economy, around half the GDP and around half the jobs before COVID was with these decentralized 30.2 million small businesses, which really look more like the free market. Nobody has too much power. They're doing their thing. And the other half of the economy is concentrated in these handful of, 10,000 big businesses. And to understand and to look at that, and it's one visual I really wish I would have put in the book that as I've talked through it, it's like, oh, everybody has their regrets. Like, what? That should have gone in there. But if you can just kind of understand that and visualize that and think about the balance of power, and if you're the government and you're getting lobbying money and you're getting money to support your campaigns, like who is it easier for you to deal with? Like this concentrated handful of people, or like 30.2 million, like who are all over the place? I think it becomes a little bit more clear why that's so important. And I think people fundamentally want to preserve those opportunities for economic freedom for your average person, as well as for innovation, because those big businesses started out as little businesses. So if we want to preserve that, we need to make sure that we're preserving that decentralized part of the economy and making it as big as possible, and not allowing for this handful of businesses to control more and more of our economy. So I think that's a big takeaway. And, hopefully just the understanding of this decentralization, whether you're a small business owner, gig worker, somebody who's into crypto, somebody who's in the creator economy, all of these things are decentralization and meant to be pushing back against central power. And there's an opportunity to, work collaboratively, because it's all going in the same direction. So I think that's really important. And then also just understanding what capitalism is and isn't, because so much stuff that gets blamed on capitalism is really cronyism in the government. And so putting a clearer set of boundaries and definitions around that, and talking about the branding and thinking about things more in terms of freedom and choice and transparency versus force, coercion, and control, and not worrying about what name you give it, I think is a much healthier, more fruitful exercise, and gives us some principles to go on, instead of saying, oh, well, this label or this party or whatever, because that's where we've all sort of lost the plot here.
Yeah, I often tell people, tell me what you hate about capitalism, and I'll show you how it's really government that you hate.
Right, exactly.
So if you could be dictator for a day and wave a magic wand and solve this problem, or do one thing that would solve this problem, and maybe it's totally politically impractical today, But if there were one thing that you could wave a magic wand about and change, what would that be to fix this?
I'd blow up the entire government and get rid of it. How's that sound?
There you go. Now, if you could do something practical, what would you ask people to do? Small business owners, normal people, what can we do? What can normal people do to make some sort of progress towards fixing this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest thing for people to do that they don't is to vote with their dollars. I mean, people forget that capitalism is freedom and choice. And so if you choose to continue to do businesses with the big companies, which is fine if you find value from that, but then don't complain when you get more and more of the economy that is owned by these big behemoths. You have a say in that. So one of the statistics I read recently is that 85% of back to school shopping is expected digitally to be captured by Amazon. If you're shopping for back to school, maybe think about using a small business retailer or somebody else. It's just an idea. You don't have to do it, but those are the kinds of things that are very easy for you to control. Somewhat more challenging is standing up against legislation that sounds good in theory and it has good intentions, but we know is going to have bad outcomes for small business. And I know a lot of small business owners are concerned, especially given cancel culture and sort of the heated environment about being vocal. But you can call your representative, people who are like-minded that you can kind of get to maybe all at the same time, call your representative. So they're getting 20 or 30 phone calls. You can find ways to do it more quietly to advocate for the small business, pro small business kinds of things, which are usually to leave small businesses alone, frankly. And then the other thing, which gets a little wonkier, but is why I think you should read the book and focus in on chapter 5. I would like to see more people calling the representatives and asking them to rein in the Federal Reserve and putting really clear guardrails. Because if we look at the amount of wealth transfer, even just in the last year, yes, when you close down a small business, some of that revenue got transferred over to Amazon and Walmart and Target, and they had an expansion of their revenues. But above and beyond that, the amount of value in terms of their stock from multiple expansion in the stock market and the disruption of risk, there were 7 tech companies that gained $3.4 trillion in value in 2020 while all of this happened. There are now 5 technology companies that are collectively worth $9 trillion. The GDP of Canada is around 2 before COVID. So if that gives you any sense of what's going on, that the value of these companies are, 4.5 times the output, the yearly output of Canada. That's pretty staggering. And that's all coming from the Federal Reserve and government together. So I would like to get more people educated about that, because I feel like fixing that issue fixes so many of the other issues that we have to contend with, but it is opaque entirely by design, which I lay out in the book. You can learn about the backstory to that. And so I don't think anybody focus. I mean, other than as we know, a handful of libertarians, right, who stand up every once in a while and say, abolish the Fed or audit the Fed or whatever, you never hear about it. And there's never any sort of practical solutions around putting some guardrails.
Yeah, because Republicans love the Federal Reserve because that's how they spend money on their projects. And Democrats love the Federal Reserve because that's how they get money for their projects. Everybody loves the Federal Reserve. It's free money. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
I mean, who doesn't love having a counterfeiting machine in the basement, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, well, Carol, this has been so fun, and we could probably talk for about 5 more hours about Rothbard and all sorts of other stuff.
Yes.
But where's the best place for people to find you and connect with you?
So the best place to reach me is on Twitter at Carol J.S. Roth. I always like to say I'm somewhat like a luxury brand. I am well curated, somewhat popular, but definitely not for everyone. So if that sounds like a fit, although very accessible, check me out on Twitter. And then I would also like to say, in terms of the book, the War on Small Business in particular, I like to walk the talk here. So I've been pushing people to purchase it locally, whether it's your own local bookshop or if you're not sure which one is the best, go to bookshop.org and they will fulfill from a local small business bookseller, which is a really great resource and easy to do online as well. So it's a good way to support small business advocacy and support a small business.
Awesome. Carol, thank you so much for the engaging conversation. And thank you for being on the Published Author Podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. I really appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to spread the word, please give us a 5-star rating review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And if you're an entrepreneur interested in writing and publishing a nonfiction book to grow your business and make an impact, visit publishedauthor.com for show notes for this podcast and other free resources.